Here are the facts. Mrs. Wentworth, the owner of Welbeck's house, has provided information about Slaught that is undeniably true, and provides the strongest evidence of a conspiracy between him and his employer. It appears that some years ago, the nephew of a certain lady disappeared from his family without a trace. This young man was meant to inherit a vast fortune from his aunt, and despite her endless inquiries and anxieties regarding his whereabouts, no one has been able to locate him. Enter Welbeck, who is aware of the situation and sees an opportunity to manipulate the situation to his advantage. He wants to replace the lost nephew with a young woman he has groomed to fit the part, both in the lady's affections while alive and in her will when she passes. Welbeck convinces the lady that her nephew has died in a foreign country, with the help of his accomplice Slaught. Slaught masquerades as a kinsman of Welbeck's, who has just arrived from Europe and claims to have witnessed the nephew's death. The two men plan to create a believable story to convince the lady of the nephew's demise. Once she believes the story, they can proceed with their scheme. At the appropriate time, Welbeck's pupil makes his entrance and, through a conversation full of calculated ambiguities, informs the lady that her nephew has indeed passed away. The pupil refuses to divulge the details of the nephew's death, despite the lady's pleas for answers. He remains steadfast and resolute, displaying a remarkable strength of character for someone involved in such a deceitful plot. Before the lady can unravel the mystery, Welbeck and his accomplice disappear into thin air, leaving behind a trail of suspicion. While the plot unfolds, an unexpected incident occurs that the conspirators had not anticipated. A bundle is discovered one night in the street containing some shabby clothing and a miniature portrait of Mrs. Wentworth's missing nephew. The bundle falls into the hands of one of the lady's acquaintances, who immediately sends it to her. During his interview with the lady, Slaught noticed a portrait on the mantelpiece. He had a sudden urge to bring up the topic of her nephew and claimed it as his own. However, when asked about how he came across the information, he became flustered and left abruptly. His behavior, coupled with the disappearance of the lad, raised suspicions about the truthfulness of his claim. But those doubts were later put to rest by a letter received from the lady's brother in England. It stated that the nephew had been seen in Charleston by someone who knew him well. The bearer of the news had convinced the boy to return home, and he had shown signs of compliance. The boy's father had also written to friends in Charleston, asking them to help persuade his son to come back and to protect him if necessary. This proves Slaught's deceit. After a moment of contemplation, I responded, "While some of the facts align with Slaught's story, the last detail contradicts it entirely. For the first time, I find myself questioning my trust in him. The recent discoveries have left my mind in disarray. I need time to process everything and weigh the consequences. I am hesitant to speak, fearing I may say something I'll regret later. I require a counselor, but you, Wortley, are unfit for the role. Your judgment lacks the necessary materials, and your personal biases may cloud your objectivity. Only my wife was qualified to share these concerns with me and help choose the best course of action. She knew Slaught's history and had observed his behavior while he lived with us. Her education and temperament prevented her from being too harsh or cruel. So I asked for her patience while I reviewed Wortley's narrative and compared it with what I knew of the lad from my own observations and conversations with him. Wortley had no choice but to agree, and we parted ways after some casual conversation. I rushed to share the news with my wife, who had a better understanding of the Slaughts than Martin's brief account could provide. The details of the youth's mistreatment of his father, his illicit affair with his stepmother, and the theft of money and a horse did not match what we had heard before. These revelations raised doubts in our minds, but we did not jump to conclusions. What caught our attention were the testimonies of Williams and Mrs. Wentworth. What was mysterious to Wortley and Watson's friends was clear to us. The vague hints gathered by these investigators and Slaught's narrative were too similar to ignore. Watson had disappeared, but we knew where his remains lay. Williams had mentioned a girdle that would be unknown to the killer. It was undisturbed and likely buried with Watson. The Morrises had been searching for it, and it was probably still with the body. What should I do with this knowledge? The task at hand was a simple one: return the bills to their rightful owner. But how could this be accomplished without resorting to dangerous methods and tedious disclosures? Who should be the recipient of these disclosures? And by what authority or agency could the treasure be extracted from the putrid decay in which it was buried? This was not a task for a lone individual. It would lead to a labyrinth of perils, suspicions, and evasions that would taint his reputation forever. The only proper course was to seek the aid of the law. Slaught must answer for his conduct. The story that he recounted to me must be made known to the world. Suspicion had already settled on him, leaving him no room for silence or obscurity. While he remained unknown and unremarkable, the publication of his story would only serve to increase the dangers he faced. Now that danger was already upon him, it might help to lessen or remove it. As we waited anxiously for Slaught's return to the city, day after day passed with no news. Though I had pressing business in Jersey, I postponed my departure for a week, hoping against hope that my young friend would make his appearance. Finally, I had no choice but to leave, but I made arrangements to be notified by my wife as soon as Slaught returned. As it turned out, my precautions were unnecessary. My business was concluded, and I was back home before the youth made any sign of his return. At that moment, I recalled Wortley's warnings and his conviction that Slaught had vanished from our sight forever. The situation had so far aligned uncomfortably with his predictions, and 1,000 doubts and misgivings crowded my mind. As I was getting ready to visit a friend and shake off my gloomy thoughts, someone knocked on my door and left a note. The note read, "Dr. Stevens is requested to come immediately to the debtor's apartments in Prune Street." There was no signature, and I had no clue who wrote it or why they needed me. Despite my uncertainty, I felt compelled to comply with the summons and headed to the prison. It was approaching evening, a time when the prison doors were usually shut and strangers were not allowed in. This made me even more eager to hurry. As I walked quickly, I tried to guess why I was needed at the prison. I soon came up with a theory that filled me with apprehension. My friend Carlton was deep in debt and had been threatened with arrest by a creditor who never forgave any of his debts. I feared that this had finally happened and dreaded the pain that it would cause Carlton's family. I knew that he was incapable of paying off his debt or persuading his creditor to show any mercy. The human mind is often drawn towards creating distress, and I was no exception. I was not aware of the uncertainty of my fears until I arrived at the prison. When I entered, I hesitated to mention Carlton's name and was let in without any questions. I assumed that the person who had summoned me would meet me in the common room. The room was filled with people who looked pale and worn out. Neglect and poverty were evident in every corner, but few showed any signs of concern about their situation. The atmosphere was thick with the smell of beer and tobacco mixed with the stench of a crowded, sweaty room. As I made my way inside, leaving the cold, crisp air outside, I struggled to breathe in the noxious fumes. The crowd was rowdy, with laughter and chatter filling the air. Cigars were clamped between teeth, and glasses of beer were held in every hand. Some played whist in the corners, while others wandered aimlessly, humming tunes absent-mindedly. I searched the faces, hoping to find a familiar one, but found only strangers. There was a glimmer of hope when I saw that the note I had received was written in a different hand than my friend's. But then I saw him, sitting alone on a bench with his head bowed and his hand covering his face. It was Carlton. My heart sank, and I approached him slowly, touching his hand to rouse him from his thoughts. He looked up at me, a flicker of joy in his eyes, but it quickly faded into a deeper gloom. Carlton was sensitive to shame and loathed being around the vulgar and the immoral. He was frail and delicate, and I knew he needed my comfort. The foul air, lack of exercise, unhealthy food, uncomfortable lodgings, and troubled thoughts were enough to cause illness and even death. These were the conditions my friend was forced to endure. He had no money to buy food, and had been forcibly taken to this place in the morning. He hadn't eaten anything since he arrived, and had no bed to sleep on. He didn't even know which room he would be staying in, or who his companions would be. My friend was not a brave person. He tended to avoid danger and give in to difficulties, but I must say that his distress on this occasion was not entirely self-centered. His parents were no longer alive, and he had two sisters who relied on him for support. One of his sisters was almost his own age, while the other was still a child. His sisters shared his physical weaknesses, intense emotions, and refined tastes. The misery of his situation was multiplied by the thought of how his sisters would feel if they knew he was in such a dire state, and the hardships they would have to face without his help. Chapter 20. I lacked the means to liberate my friend through the payment of his debt. However, I could strike a deal with the prison keeper to ensure he wouldn't starve. I made efforts to find him suitable lodging within the constraints of the circumstances. I promised to provide solace and support to his sisters, and through my cheerful demeanor and regular visits, I aimed to alleviate some of the hardships surrounding him. Once the initial shock had passed, he inquired about the circumstances that led to our unexpected reunion. Aware of my inability to provide any significant assistance and unwilling to burden me with his troubles, he had refrained from informing me of his situation. I was surprised when I showed him the note, and he denied writing it, as he was not familiar with the handwriting. Only the lawyer and officer were aware of his circumstances. It seemed probable that a friend, who knew of my affection for Carlton, had sent me the mysterious note to seek my help. Although we speculated about the identity and intention of the sender, we had more pressing concerns to attend to. I requested to speak with the keeper to inquire about Carlton's accommodations. The keeper informed me that all the rooms were full except for one, which had only one tenant due to the recent dismissal of 3 individuals. The tenant was ill and had a friend with him. Carlton could share the room with the tenant, with or without his consent. This was the best arrangement, and I immediately set out to seek the tenant's permission. Upon entering the room, I was surprised to see Martin Slaught. His face showed nothing but happiness at our meeting, despite the fatigue and anxiety he had previously displayed. It occurred to me that Slaught was the sender of the note. To find both Carlton and Slaught in this place at this time was the most unexpected and unwelcome of all outcomes. The same hour had brought me the knowledge of the fates of 2 individuals whom I held dear. As soon as I embraced him, he took my hand and led me to a bed in the corner of the room. A man was lying on it, whom I recognized as the person Slaught had described to me, even though I had never met him before. The features Slaught had vividly portrayed were strikingly evident in the sunken and worn face before me. Welbeck was easily distinguishable from any other man once you had seen or heard of him. He had stronger motives than others for avoiding wrongdoing because his unique appearance made it incredibly difficult for him to hide or disguise himself. He was pale and thin and appeared to be asleep. However, before I could even exchange glances with Slaught or ask about the situation, Welbeck awoke. As soon as he saw me, he jolted up and gave Slaught a look of reproach. Slaught understood what was happening and tried to calm him down. "This person," he said, "is my friend. He is also a doctor, and I thought you might need medical attention." Welbeck replied with disdain and anger, "You don't understand my condition, boy. My illness is much deeper than any examination he could perform. I had hoped you were gone. Your well-meaning attempts only make my suffering worse." He stood up from the bed and said firmly, "You are intruders in my room. This is my space, and I want to be left alone." Slaught was at a loss for words, but eventually said, "I truly have good intentions, and I'm sorry I can't persuade you otherwise. Perhaps tomorrow, a more rational conversation could be had with you, or maybe your mood will change. But to help myself, I will ask for my friend's assistance," I said. Upon hearing this, Welbeck's anger and confusion only grew. He stumbled over his words as he cried out, "What do you mean? Even though you're impulsive and reckless, you wouldn't tell this person about me?" He stopped himself, realizing that his words were only leading to the very outcome he feared. This realization, coupled with his fear of Slaught revealing more of his secrets, left him speechless and terrified. Slaught replied quickly, saying, "I understand your fears and desires. I'm obligated to tell you the truth. Your story has already been shared with this person. Anything I have seen or heard within your home, anything that has come from your own mouth, has been truthfully told to him." Welbeck's face showed a mix of disbelief and horror. He was speechless for a moment, overwhelmed with emotions. "It can't be true. Such a heinous act is beyond your capabilities. Your abilities are extraordinary. Each new action you take surpasses the last and defies all expectations. But this betrayal, this breaking of promises, this disregard for the future, it's unbelievable," he said, looking to Slaught for a denial. "I know that my actions may seem unforgivably foolish or wicked to you, but I will not lie. I repeat, everything is known to him," Slaught replied. "Your birth, your early fortunes, the incidents at Charleston and Wilmington, your treatment of the brother and sister, your interview with Watson, and the fatal outcome of that encounter. I have revealed everything to him, just as it was told to me." Upon hearing this, Welbeck was overwhelmed by shock, causing him to lose his caution and strength. He sank onto the side of the bed, still wearing an air of disbelief as he continued to gaze at Slaught. His tone was less vehement as he spoke, So you have betrayed me? Have you closed every path to my redemption? Am I now known as a seducer and murderer, accused of planning heinous crimes and carrying out the worst of them? Infamy and death await me. I know they are my fate, but I did not expect to receive them from your hands. To think that beneath that innocent appearance lay a heart that is treacherous and cruel. But go, leave me to myself. This blow has shattered the last remnants of my hope. Leave me to prepare my neck for the gallows, and my lips for this final bitter cup. Slaught struggled to hold back his tears and replied, I foresaw all of this, and I was prepared to endure it. My friend and I will withdraw as you wish, but tomorrow I will return, not to defend my faith or my humanity, not to make you retract your accusations or forgive the perceived wrongs I may have committed, but to rescue you from your current plight, or to provide you with the strength to face it. With those words, Slaught led the way out of the room, and I followed him in silence. The strangeness and abruptness of the scene left me unable to intervene. I watched with a mix of new and indescribable emotions. We reached the street before my recollection fully returned. It was then that I remembered the purpose that had brought me to Welbeck's chamber. That purpose remained unfulfilled, so I asked Slaught to wait for a moment while I returned to the house. I approached the keeper once more, and informed him that I would leave it to him to inform Welbeck of the necessity of sharing his quarters with a stranger. After that, I quickly met up with Slaught on the street, and wasted no time in demanding an explanation for the scene I had just witnessed. How did you manage to become Welbeck's companion once again? Why didn't you inform me by letter of your arrival in Malverton, and of what happened during your absence? What became of Mr. Hadwin and Wallace? I inquired. I can tell that you never received my letters. The story of what happened since we last met is long and complicated. I'm more than willing to share it with you, but not here. Let's head to your house and I'll reveal everything. I've gotten myself into a lot of trouble, and I'm counting on your counsel and assistance to help me out, Slaught replied. As I arrived at my own door, a servant from the family where Carlton and his sisters lived caught up to me. I quickly understood why she was there and what she needed. She came to ask about my friend who had left his home in the morning with a stranger and hadn't returned yet. His absence had caused some concern, and his sister had sent the servant to me to find out any information I had about why he was being held up. I was hesitant to answer at first, but I realized that it was my duty to tell her the truth. I knew that it was important to put an end to her anxiety and prevent any false rumors from spreading. I told the servant that I had just seen Mr. Carlton, that he was safe, and that I would be seeing his sister soon to explain his absence. Although my curiosity about Slaught and Welbeck was burning, I decided to delay satisfying it until I had visited Miss Carlton. I had not seen her often, as my friendship with her brother had only recently formed and been mostly cultivated during our meetings at my home. I had intended to introduce her to my wife, but various accidents had prevented me from doing so. However, now she needed comfort and guidance more than ever, and failing to provide it would have been unforgivable. So I left Slaught, asking him to wait for my return, and promised to come back as soon as possible after fulfilling my obligation. When I arrived at Miss Carlton's apartment, I tried to appear as calm as I could. She was sitting at a desk, holding a pen and a piece of parchment. She greeted me warmly, and my cheerful demeanor seemed to have lifted her spirits. "You come to tell me why my brother is absent today," she said. "Until I received your message, I was worried. He usually spends this day wandering through the fields, but I suppose the stormy weather prevented him from doing so. Could you please tell me what's keeping him?" To avoid the awkwardness of the situation, I tried to steer the conversation in a different direction. Looking at the parchment, I said, "This is an unusual occupation for a lady. I knew that my friend pursued this trade and made a living by sealing the deals of others, but I had no idea that his sister had taken up the pen." "I had to do it out of necessity," Miss Carlton replied. "My brother's impatience and frailty made it impossible for him to do this work. He did it reluctantly but diligently, spending 3 nights a week and the entire day on it. It would have killed my brother long ago if I hadn't thought of sharing his tasks. At first the pen was difficult and tedious, but I grew accustomed to it. It's much better than the needle, which used to be my only tool. This arrangement allows my brother to exercise and have fun without reducing our profits, and my time is now more enjoyable and profitable than before. I appreciate your reasoning. It's good to be prepared for unexpected events. If your brother were to get sick, you could support us both." The lady's expression changed at those words. She put her hand on my arm and asked in a fluttering voice, Is my brother sick? No, he's perfectly healthy. I was just making a harmless observation. I'm sorry to see that you're so quick to jump to conclusions. If I were to say that your plan is useful for providing for us when your brother is unable to work due to illness or when he's thrown into jail by some cruel creditor, you would probably assume that he's in jail right now. As soon as I finished speaking, the lady's piercing gaze fixed anxiously on mine. After a moment of silence, she exclaimed, "The conclusion is too obvious. I know his fate. We've been expecting it for a long time, and I've prepared myself for it. I hope he'll find the situation less difficult than I would, but I fear his temper will get the best of him." When her fears were confirmed, she didn't burst into tears or become hysterical. She quickly wiped away a few tears and listened to my account of what had happened recently with gratitude. She didn't need consoling. Her mind was more adept than mine at finding ways to ease the pain of affliction. She noted that this was not the worst thing that could happen. The person they owed money to might be persuaded by reason and pleading. If they were successful, not only would the disaster be averted, but they could also gain security from future harassment, which they had not had for a long time. If he remained stubborn, their situation was not hopeless. Carlton's profession allowed him to continue earning money without increasing his expenses. By working together, they could hope to save enough to pay off the debt in the near future. What worried her most was the harmful effects of depression and sedentary work on her brother's health. However, this was not inevitable. Encouragement and example could inspire fortitude, and no condition prevented them from exerting themselves physically. The less willing he was to pursue the means of deliverance and happiness available to him, the more necessary it became for her to inspire and strengthen his resolve. Although I was captivated by the lady's charm and demeanor, I was also impressed by her wisdom and energy. I eagerly promised to support her in any plan she devised for her own or her brother's benefit, and after spending some time with her, I took my leave. I now regretted not knowing more about this woman earlier. It was easy to see that she was incredibly feminine and lovely, but people had wrongly assumed that her external fragility was indicative of intellectual weakness. She was used to avoiding attention, and her reserve was mistaken for timidity. I only visited Carlton when I had a few spare hours, and when his regular visitors were absent. On these occasions, I only stayed briefly and focused mainly on her brother. I now resolved to make up for my past neglect, not only with my own attentiveness, but also with that of my wife. Upon my return home, I found my wife and Slaught deep in conversation. I knew that I had to reveal the truth about Carlton's situation, even though I dreaded the effect it would have on my sensitive wife. I wanted these two women to know each other as soon as possible, but I knew that I had to start with the news of the disaster that had occurred. As soon as I entered the room, Slaught turned to me with an anxious look and asked, "Do you know Francis Carlton?" I was surprised by the mention of Carlton's name, but I admitted that I knew him. "Do you know where he is now?" Slaught asked urgently. I explained how I had come to know about Carlton's situation and the purpose of my recent trip. I asked Slaught where his interest in Carlton came from. He had overheard the name mentioned in the prison. Two people were talking quietly in a corner, and he had managed to catch the name and learn that Carlton had recently been taken to prison. This was not the first time he had heard the name. Memories connected to Carlton had made him anxious about his fate. When the name was mentioned again in conversation with my wife, his curiosity was piqued once more. I was willing to share all the information I had, but Slaught's own story was too remarkable to ignore. I refused to discuss any other topic until he had explained everything that had happened to him since we last saw each other. Slaught agreed to postpone his own story and told me everything that had happened to him up until the present moment. Chapter 21. The following is Slaught's account of what happened to him upon leaving our home. Upon parting with you, my objective was to reach the Hadwin's residence as swiftly as possible. Slaught began. I traveled with haste, expecting to arrive by midday despite being on foot. The use of my muscles did not hinder my thoughts, but rather enhanced them. My recent journey to the city was driven by reasons and accompanied by incidents that remained present in my mind. To contemplate them was to gain a more thorough understanding of the individuals and objects that still lingered in my sight. It seemed as though years of contemplation were necessary to fully comprehend their significance and potential consequences. If individuals are primarily distinguished by their methods of attention, whether it be towards external and sensory objects or abstract ideas and reflections, then I would belong to the latter category. My existence is a succession of thoughts rather than actions. Deduction and reasoning keep my senses unoccupied, while my imagination renders my eyes vacant and inactive. However, there was one motive that made me more observant of my surroundings than usual: the memory of Clemenza Lodi's captivating form. I recalled her situation as I had witnessed it, as Welbeck had described it, and as you had depicted it. The past was irreversible, but the future could still be shaped and molded. Her state was likely precarious. She might already be in a state of despair, plagued by temptation and anguish, or perhaps danger was approaching her, and the worst hardships were yet to come. I remained ignorant of her circumstances. Could I not dispel this ignorance? Would some benefit not arise from timely and compassionate intervention? You had mentioned that she had been residing with Mrs. Villars, who still lived in the vicinity. The location had been adequately described, and I realized that I was nearing it. Soon enough, I caught sight of its painted roof and 5 chimneys as I passed through a pathway lined with catalpa trees. When I reached the gate that led to this pathway, I paused. It felt as though this moment would determine the liberty and innocence of that young woman. I had the opportunity to stand before her, assess her true situation, and guide her towards a path of honor and safety. This could be my last chance, as further delay might render my intervention futile. But how could I intervene? I was a stranger to her language, and she was unfamiliar with mine. Gaining access to her was a matter of simply requesting it. However, once the meeting took place, how would I explain my intentions and convey my wishes? What viable solution could I propose? Now, I pondered, I understand the value of the wealth I have often disregarded. The ability to satisfy our basic needs and enjoy physical pleasures does not change or expand with increased wealth. Our own needs are intertwined with the needs of others, and it is always just and feasible to employ any surplus we possess, once our own necessities are met, to alleviate the needs of others. Unfortunately, I had no excess resources in my possession. I lacked the means to provide this unfortunate girl with proper clothing and sustenance. I had no house to her home to, and I lacked the means to provide her with shelter and sustenance. However, even though I am impoverished and weak, I still have friends and a home. Can she not be admitted to the same refuge where I am heading? This idea struck me suddenly, and the more I contemplated it, the more reasonable it appeared. It was not only the only option, but also the best one that could be suggested. The Hadwins were kind, hospitable, and trusting. Though their provisions might be simple and unrefined, they were plentiful and nourishing. Their residence was secluded and inconspicuous, unlikely to attract unwanted attention or malicious judgment. Their open and genuine nature would make them easy to persuade, and their sympathies were readily stirred. I was almost certain that they would readily protect this orphaned girl. Why not anticipate their consent and present myself to their embrace and warm welcome, along with her? However, upon further reflection, I realized that such haste would be improper. Whether Wallace had arrived in Malverton, whether Mr. Hadwin had avoided the infection, and whether their home was a place of safety and tranquility, or a scene of devastation, were questions that remained unanswered. The sensible and prudent course of action was to press forward, offering whatever feeble consolation and support I could provide to the Hadwins if they were in distress, or seeking their agreement to my plan regarding Clemenza if they were in a favorable situation. Motivated by these considerations, I continued my journey. As I looked ahead, I spotted a carriage and horse parked by the left-hand fence several hundred yards away. At first it seemed like an ordinary and unremarkable sight, hardly worth noticing. However, as I drew closer, I thought I recognized the same carriage in which I had secured a seat for the ailing Wallace through my persistent pleas, as I have recounted before. It was a dilapidated and outdated vehicle, one that could hardly be mistaken or forgotten once seen. The horse stood tied to a post, but its rider was nowhere to be found. Concern filled me as I pondered the fate of the missing person and wondered if the carriage's owner could provide any information. I paused, contemplating my next course of action. Surely the rider couldn't be too far away and might return shortly. If I waited patiently for a few moments, I could potentially have a conversation with them and alleviate my worries. As I stood there, the familiar figure I had encountered previously emerged from the nearby woods. It took him a moment to recognize me, but soon we both recalled our prior meeting. Curiosity piqued. I inquired about the young man he had been responsible for during our last encounter. He proceeded to recount how, upon leaving the city and immersing himself in the refreshing countryside air, the young man had undergone a remarkable transformation. Weariness and fear had dissipated, replaced by a newfound sense of joy and engaging conversation. The young man spoke openly about his illness, sharing amusing anecdotes, some of which my companion relayed to me. However, as I listened intently, a sense of dismay washed over me, as the stories hinted at a mind tainted by association with immoral individuals. Continuing his narrative, my companion revealed that the young man's newfound happiness had been short-lived, vanishing as abruptly as it had appeared. He fell ill suddenly and felt an urgent need to leave the carriage. The movement of the carriage made him feel sick to his stomach and dizzy. His companion was worried about him but didn't want to leave him alone. He tried to cheer him up, but it was no use. Even though the nearest house was several hundred yards away, and it was uncertain if they would be willing to help, Wallace refused to go any further. Despite his companion's attempts to persuade him, he left the carriage and lay down on the grassy bank beside the road. His companion was aware of the danger of being around a sick person, but felt that he had done enough to help him. Wallace insisted that if he continued to ride, he would surely die. His companion left him to his own devices. I had assumed that he would be safe from harm, but now it seemed that he might have died from a painful and lingering illness, brought on by the selfishness of others, the lack of timely treatment, and exposure to harsh weather. However, there was some uncertainty about his fate. It was my responsibility to find out what happened to him and to bring the Hadwins accurate information about his condition. Where did Wallace and his companion part ways? It was 3 miles further down the road. The location and appearance of the house nearby were described in detail. It was possible that Wallace had sought refuge there, and perhaps the people there could provide some information about him. I had to part ways with my informant, who was headed to the city. Upon hearing the man's account of Wallace's behavior and witnessing his reckless and dissolute nature, I began to view his death with less sorrow. Such a person seemed undeserving of someone as devoutly pure and devotedly faithful as Susan Hadwin. If he truly loved her, it was likely that he would seek another companion, disregarding his vows. And if he did remain committed to his initial promises, his motives would be selfish, and the revelation of his hidden flaws could inflict greater misery upon his wife than his untimely demise or treacherous abandonment. The sole reason I had ventured into the infected city, endangering my own life and miraculously escaping its perils, was to save this man. But now I questioned whether the end I sought justified the means. Was it arrogance to consider my own life too high a price to pay for his preservation? I did not regret my past actions, for my intentions were just, and I had chosen the best course available to me with my limited knowledge. My happiness would stem from the knowledge that my intentions were fair. If these intentions were thwarted by the ignorance of others or my own, it was merely a consequence of human fallibility. Honest purposes, even if they don't bring happiness to others, will at least secure it for the one who harbors them. These reflections dispelled my regrets, and I prepared to find joy whether Wallace had managed to escape or had met his end. The house I sought appeared before me, and I inquired about its master or mistress. I was directed to a lady of modest appearance, embodying the essence of a diligent housewife. My curiosity would soon be satisfied. Wallace, easily recognizable from my description, had arrived at her doorstep on the evening of the day he left the city. The fear of the fever was discussed at length and with crude language. I assumed the woman was trying to justify her refusal to let the sick man in. However, her final words were different. Wallace was eventually admitted and given proper care. Fortunately, he only suffered from extreme weakness and was able to recover quickly with rest, good food, and fresh air. He stayed with them for 3 weeks, but left without expressing any gratitude, offering payment, or revealing his future plans. These new details, combined with what I already knew, shed no positive light on Wallace's character. It was clear that he had gone to Malverton, and nothing was stopping me from following him. One of my biggest flaws is my impulsive nature. I make decisions quickly and act on them with great speed. In this instance, I was determined to execute my plan as soon as possible. Miss Hadwin deserved to be happy, and love was the most important thing to her. A disappointment in this area was a major tragedy. Anyone who wanted her affection had to appear virtuous, even if they were actually immoral and foolish. This facade might work for a while, but it would eventually be exposed. I decided to reveal everything I knew about Wallace to him and his lover with complete honesty and confidence. I wanted to do this while they were together, not apart. Wallace would have the chance to refute, downplay, or confirm the accusations. Throughout the remainder of the day, my mind was consumed by the images that had been etched into it. The journey to my destination was an arduous one, as the road was both muddy and dimly lit. As the evening approached, I finally caught sight of the familiar dwelling. Since my last visit, winter had taken hold of the land, rendering the surroundings bleak and desolate. The area around the house was empty, unkempt, and desolate. The contrast between the current state of the area and the vibrancy of summer that I had witnessed during my previous visit was distressing and seemed to portend misfortune. My spirits sank as I observed the overall lack of activity and sound. Without warning, I entered the parlor but found no one in sight or sound. The chimney was adorned with evergreen shrubs, as it had been during the summer, but there was no evidence of a recent fire having been lit, even though it was already the second month of winter. This was a troubling sign, as this was the time and place where those who had gathered during previous years would have assembled. A narrow entryway led to the kitchen. As I opened the door and entered, I found an elderly man sitting in the corner, his face lined with wrinkles, but his health and spirit still strong. His clothing, consisting of a homespun coat, leather breeches, and blue yarn socks, was well suited to his gaunt and shriveled frame. In his right hand was a wooden bowl filled with hasty pudding, which he had just replenished from a nearby pot that was still steaming on the coals. In his left hand was a spoon, which he had just dipped into a bottle of molasses. His actions were interrupted by my arrival. He looked up and exclaimed, "Heyday! Who's this that enters other people's homes without even a courteous greeting? What's your business? Whom do you seek?" I had never encountered this person before, assuming them to be a new household member, and I asked for Mr. Hadwin. "Ah," he replied with a sigh, "William Hadwin. Is it him you're looking for? Poor man. He passed away many days ago." My heart sank at this news. "Dead," I exclaimed. "Do you mean to say he is dead?" The intensity of my exclamation caught the attention of someone standing outside, who promptly entered the kitchen. It was Eliza Hadwin. The moment she laid eyes on me, she let out a loud shriek and, rushing into my arms, fainted. The old man dropped his bowl and, rising from his seat, stared at me and the unconscious girl in turn. My own emotions, a mixture of joy, sorrow, and surprise, momentarily rendered me unable to act, much like her. Finally he spoke, saying, "I understand this. I know who you are, and I will inform her of your arrival." With those words he hastily left the room. After a short while the delicate girl regained her senses. She did not retreat from my supporting embrace, but instead leaned against my chest, surrendering herself to passionate weeping. I made no attempt to stifle her tears, believing that their release would be beneficial. I had not forgotten the profound sensitivity and natural charm of this girl, nor had I forgotten the reservations that had once compelled me to restrain a passion whose course was easily discernible. These new demonstrations of her affection were both sorrowful and delightful. The premature loss of her father and my friend weighed heavily on our hearts, and despite my efforts to remain strong, my tears mingled with hers. Both of us were suddenly startled by a faint scream emanating from upstairs. Immediately, we heard unsteady footsteps in the corridor, and a figure rushed into the room, pale, gaunt, worn out, and frantic. She cast a piercing gaze at me, let out a feeble cry, and collapsed onto the floor, lifeless. It wasn't difficult to comprehend the scene unfolding before us. I now suspected, and subsequent inquiries confirmed, that the old man had mistaken me for Wallace, and had conveyed the news of his return to the elder sister. This devastating disappointment, which had nearly extinguished their dwindling hopes but now surged back with overwhelming force, proved too much for a body teetering on the edge of dissolution. Eliza's condition absorbed all my concern and reawakened her sister's fading strength. I gently lifted the fallen girl into my arms, and under her sister's guidance we carried her to her chamber. At that moment, I had a chance to observe the changes that a few months had wrought upon this once lovely figure. The sight filled me with anguish, yet a strange fascination compelled me to keep my gaze fixed upon the deteriorating form. Eliza knelt by the bedside, her face buried in her hands, attempting to stifle her sobs to no avail. I sat beside her, motionless, holding the fragile and withered hand of the sufferer. With immeasurable concern, I watched for signs of life's return. It came, but only to reveal symptoms that it would soon depart forever. For a brief period, I was rendered powerless, a mere spectator of the ruin surrounding me. Yet this state of helplessness swiftly gave way to resolutions and reflections more suited to the pressing circumstances. The immediate instinct was to summon a physician, but it became evident that the patient had been gradually declining toward this state, and that the final struggle had begun. There was nothing left to do but to keep vigil by her side as she drew her last breath, and to prepare for the rites of burial once she had passed. The surviving sister needed solace and support, and it was my duty to provide it. I approached her gently and led her into another room, where the old man, trembling with awe and wonder, was eager to be of service. I instructed him to light a fire in Eliza's room, while I convinced my gentle companion to stay in this room and entrust me with the care of her sister. I sat vigil by the dying woman's bedside until her final moments. I realized that the house was devoid of any occupants apart from the two sisters and the aged man. I went in search of him and found him huddled by the kitchen fire, puffing on his pipe. I sat down beside him and engaged in conversation. He revealed that he had worked as Mr. Hadwin's servant for many years, and had recently started farming in the area for his own benefit. One day in October, while at the tavern, he learned that his former master had contracted the fever during a recent visit to the city and had passed away from it. As soon as he fell ill, his servants abandoned him, and the neighbors refused to come near. It was up to his daughters to care for him in his final days, and it was they who dug his grave and laid him to rest. Even after his death, the fear of contagion persisted, leaving the sisters to suffer alone. Caleb, upon hearing of their plight, rushed to their aid, and had remained in their employ ever since. He had a kind heart, but it was clear that his skills were limited to following orders. The eldest daughter's health deteriorated due to the loss of her father and Wallace, and the younger sister became her nurse, with Caleb always on hand to assist with tasks within his capabilities. Despite the assistance they received from their neighbors, the lingering specter of the plague kept them terrified and isolated. Susan, though weak and bedridden in the past week, miraculously found the strength to rise upon hearing the news of Wallace's return. How undeserving that man was of such unwavering and eternal affection. I couldn't allow myself to dwell on the sufferings endured by these women. Instead, I focused on finding the best solution to end their plight. After a brief deliberation, I decided to make my way to a house several miles away. Its owner, though not immune to the prevailing panic, had shown more compassion and generosity towards these unfortunate girls than others. During my previous stay in the area, I had come to know his character as one of kindness and benevolence. Eliza, overwhelmed by exhaustion and relieved by my presence, soon fell into a deep sleep. I instructed Caleb to keep watch over the house until my return, which I promised would be before midnight. With that, I embarked on my journey to Mr. Ellis's house. The weather was mild and damp, turning the meadows into treacherous terrain. The once frozen ground, covered in snow, had transformed into gullies and pools, leaving no room for pickiness when it came to choosing a path. I also had to cross a brook swollen by the recent thaw. The makeshift bridge I had previously erected had vanished, forcing me to wade through the water. Finally, I approached the house I was heading towards. At such a late hour, farmers and their servants were typically in bed, leaving their doorsteps in the care of vigilant watchdogs. Mr. Ellis owned 2 dogs whose fierceness and watchfulness were daunting to a stranger. However, I was confident that they would recognize me as an old acquaintance and allow me to approach. My intuition proved correct as they greeted me with a multitude of affectionate gestures under the starlit sky. Upon reaching the house, I realized that its occupants had already retired for the night. Undeterred, I knocked on the door with fervor to rouse Mr. Ellis from his sleep. He appeared at a window above, impatient and anxious about the disturbance. I revealed my identity and pleaded with him to allow me a few minutes to converse with him. He promptly dressed himself and ushered me inside, where we sat before the fireplace in the kitchen. He was taken aback by my appearance, as he had heard of my elopement from Mr. Hadwin's house. He was unaware of the circumstances that led to my departure, and the events that had transpired since. Our current meeting was the last thing he expected, and his curiosity was evident in his features. However, this was not the time to indulge his curiosity. My purpose was to secure accommodation for Eliza Hadwin in his home. I recounted the inconveniences that she was currently facing with honesty and simplicity, and narrated the events that had taken place since my arrival. Mr. Ellis was moved by my tale, and I continued to passionately describe the helplessness of this girl. She had inherited the farm after the death of her father and sister. Being a woman, and of a certain age, she was deemed unsuitable for overseeing the harvest and threshing. The only option left was to lease the land to someone else and find refuge in the home of a relative or friend, subsisting on the rent received. However, her presence in that house was both futile and perilous. I suggested to my companion that it would be best to move her to his own home immediately. He hesitated and exhibited reluctance, which I attributed to his irrational fear of contagion. I appealed to his sense of reason and compassion, explaining the true cause of the elder daughter's death, and assuring him that the youngest was only suffering from distress. I even offered to accompany her to his home to ensure her safety. All that was required was for him to not turn her away when she arrived. Despite my efforts, he remained fearful and hesitant. Eventually, he mentioned that her uncle lived only 16 miles away and was her natural protector, who would have no qualms about taking her in. He believed it was the duty of family members to help each other, and while helping those in need was commendable, risking one's own life was not. I used his doubtful and indecisive demeanor to continue persuading him to overcome his reservations. His dislike of my plan grew stronger as I pleaded with him, until he finally refused to agree to it under any circumstances. Ellis was not unfeeling, but his decision was not a sign of his lack of compassion. Rather, it was a result of his deep-seated fears. He was someone who deserved pity rather than anger. His actions were akin to a man who, in fear of his own death, pushes his companion from the plank that saved him from drowning, but cannot support both their weights. Seeing that he was unyielding to my pleas, I pondered on his suggestion of seeking refuge with her uncle. It was true that her uncle was her legal guardian, having lost both her parents. His worldly knowledge, his property and influence, might make him better suited for the role than I was. To seek shelter elsewhere might be unfair to them both. After some reflection, I not only put aside my disappointment at Ellis's refusal, but even thanked him for his advice and insight. I said my goodbyes to him and hurried back to Hadwin's. According to Caleb, Eliza was still asleep, and there was no need to wake her urgently. However, we had to do something about the poor girl who had passed away. The necessary steps were clear. All that was left was to dig a grave and give her remains a dignified and solemn burial as time allowed. There were two ways to go about this. I contemplated waiting until the next day, until a coffin could be arranged and transported here, until the woman who specialized in preparing the customary garments for the deceased could be located and hired to assist, until relatives, friends, and neighbors could be summoned to attend the funeral, until a carriage could be procured to transport the body to a cemetery belonging to a meeting house 5 miles away, and until those whose profession it was to dig graves had prepared one within the sacred grounds for her interment. Or I could eschew this laborious, tedious, and expensive ritual and lay the daughter to rest beside her father in his grave. I favored the latter option. While burial customs may generally be appropriate, and even if they are absurd, it may still be proper to adhere to them, there are undoubtedly instances in which we must forego them. I believed this to be one such instance. The weather was harsh and inhospitable. Adhering to the usual procedures would require a great deal of time, effort, and expense. There was no one but myself to carry out these tasks, and I had insufficient resources. Conforming to these traditions would only prolong Eliza's anguish and unnecessarily deplete her resources. After contemplating these thoughts for some time, I rose from my seat and instructed Caleb to accompany me. We proceeded to an outlying shed where farmers' implements were typically stored. I equipped him and myself with a spade and urged him to lead me to the location where Mr. Hadwin had been interred. He displayed some reluctance to comply and seemed somewhat apprehensive, as if my intention was to disturb, rather than safeguard, the tranquility of the deceased. I explained my intentions to him in order to remove any doubts he may have had, but he was still shocked when he discovered the truth. He stammered out his objections to my plan, believing that there was only one decent and proper way to bury someone. He said he could not assist me in pursuing any other mode. Caleb's aversion to the scheme might have been easily overcome, but I knew his mind was both flexible and obstinate. He could be persuaded to act by arguments and entreaties, but his old convictions would soon return, and his deviation from the norm would only lead to regret. Although his aid was of some use, it was not indispensable. I did not ask for his agreement, or even try to convince him to direct me to Hadwin's grave. The idea that one spot was more suitable for the burial than any other was a groundless superstition. In a gentle tone, I asked Caleb to return to the kitchen and let me act as I saw fit. I then went to the orchard, where a corner of the field was slightly elevated above the rest. The tallest tree of the group grew there, and I had previously placed a bench there, making it my retreat during periods of leisure. It was recommended for its seclusion, verdant foliage, and profound quiet. On one side was a potato field, on the other a melon patch, and in front of me, rows of apple trees. This was where I used to seek the benefits of contemplation and study the manuscripts of Lodi. It had only been a few months since I last visited this spot. Standing there, surveying the transformed world, my thoughts drifted back to the revolutions that had unfolded since my last visit to this very spot. The stark contrast between my present somber purpose and the circumstances that had previously brought me here could not be ignored. With a resolute determination, I swiftly decided to dig a grave for Susan. It was imperative to prepare a fitting resting place to honor her memory, and so I began the arduous task. The digging was strenuous, but I persisted, fueled by my unwavering resolve. Gradually, I fashioned a cavity of adequate dimensions to cradle Susan's lifeless form. Once the grave was ready, I returned to the house and tenderly lifted Susan's body in my arms. Caleb remained seated in the kitchen, while Eliza slumbered soundly in her chamber, both blissfully unaware of my activities. Stepping outside, I carefully laid Susan to rest in the freshly dug earth, shielding her from the gaze of the living. Reflecting on this solemn act, a range of emotions floods my being. It feels as though I acted with undue haste, driven by a stoic detachment rather than reason. I was unshaken and resolute in purpose, yet there lingered a sense of awe and transcendence in the act of burying Susan. Perhaps this unwavering resolve stemmed from my recent trials and tribulations. Some minds are better suited to endure perilous emergencies than others. If reason gains strength through the numbing of sensibility, then it may be just for sensibility to diminish. However, my focus now shifted to ensuring Eliza's safety. Though sleep beckoned, uncertainty about her fate and the urgency to secure her a new home kept my thoughts restless and incessant. I impatiently awaited her awakening the next day, eager to confer with her and formulate plans for the future. After regaining her memory, she asked about her sister. She longed to see Susan's face and kiss her lips one more time, hoping it would bring some relief to her grief. But when she was told the truth, that Susan was gone forever, she erupted in fresh agony. She felt that as long as she could still see and touch her friend, her loss wasn't complete and hopeless. She accused me of acting without justice or reason, of robbing her of her only comfort, and of treating her sister's remains with disrespect. I explained to her as gently as I could why I had acted as I did. I wasn't surprised or angry when she dismissed my reasons as pointless and insulting. Her grief was understandable, and it was natural to be overwhelmed by it. To remain calm and rational in the face of such pain and turmoil is a rare gift of wisdom or a sign of callous foolishness. Eventually, her anger subsided, and she became grateful and tender. She agreed to follow any plan I suggested to help her. I suggested she seek help from her uncle in her time of need. She reacted with fear and reluctance at the mention of his name. It was clear she didn't agree with my idea, and she didn't want to turn to her uncle for help. I asked her to explain her objections or suggest an alternative plan. She had no friends or relations besides her uncle Philip, whom she couldn't live with, and me. She had never left her father's house before. Considering her strong aversion to staying with her uncle, I decided not to insist on that option. I initially suspected her antipathy towards him to be unfounded or capricious. I urged her to explain the specific aspects of her uncle's character that made him objectionable, but she refused to provide further details and maintained that his house was unsuitable for her. Accepting her firm stance on the matter, I searched for an alternative solution. I proposed the idea of finding her accommodation as a boarder in the city, a village, or a remote area of the country. Ellis, her closest and wealthiest neighbor, had already declined to take her in, but there might be others who were not burdened by the same fears. There were people within a day's journey who were unaware of the circumstances surrounding Hadwin's death. But would it be morally acceptable to take advantage of their ignorance? I believed that their willingness to help should not be based on deception. As I pondered on this dilemma, the memories of my recent journey resurfaced, and I recalled the kind woman who had provided shelter for Wallace. She seemed to fit the description of the person I was seeking. Her treatment of Wallace demonstrated her freedom from irrational fears, and indicated that she had room in her house for an occasional guest. Encouraged by this realization, I informed my weeping companion that I had remembered a family where she would be treated kindly. I suggested that we waste no time in going there. We had horses on the farm, grazing in the meadows, and 2 of them could carry us to the chosen place within a few hours. She eagerly agreed to this proposal, and I inquired about the arrangements for our current dwelling and who should be entrusted with its care. Since the father's property now belonged to his daughter, she had the authority to decide its fate. Eliza's mind worked quickly and intelligently, but her lack of experience sometimes made her appear foolish. She was eager to leave her current situation and entrust herself and her property to my care without any restrictions. Though we had not known each other long, she relied on me for protection and guidance, just as she had with her father. When I asked her what she thought should be done, she deferred to my judgment, believing that I knew best. As I observed her innocence and simplicity, I couldn't help but feel protective of her. There were those who would take advantage of her trust and deceive her for their own gain, but I was not one of them. I saw her welfare as a precious responsibility, and I would watch over her and her property with the same care and concern as any father or brother. I knew that Eliza's father may have designated the distribution of his property and the guardianship of his daughters in his will. When I suggested this to Eliza, she remembered an incident that occurred after her father's last trip to the city. He had written his will and given it to her sister Susan to keep in a drawer. Eliza retrieved the will and discovered that her father had left his property to both of his daughters, with his brother Philip as the executor and guardian until they turned 20. Upon hearing her uncle's name as the executor, Eliza was frightened and asked, "What is that? What power does that give him?" I admitted that I wasn't entirely sure of the executor's power, but explained that he would likely have control of her property until she came of age. "He will also be responsible for your well-being until that time," I told her. "Does he get to decide where I will live?" she asked. "He has the authority of a father," I said. This assurance deeply troubled her. She lowered her gaze to the ground, lost in contemplation for a while. "What if my father had not made a will?" "In that case, a guardian would still be necessary, but you would have the right to choose that person," I informed her. "Would my uncle have no involvement in my affairs?" "I'm not a lawyer," I replied, "but I presume that all authority over your well-being and possessions would rest with the guardian you choose." "Then I am free," she declared suddenly. With a swift motion, she tore the will into several pieces, which she had been holding during the conversation, and threw them into the fire. I was taken aback by this unexpected action. My astonishment prevented me from attempting to salvage the paper from the flames, and it was quickly consumed. I was uncertain how to interpret this sacrifice. It displayed a strength of character that seemed at odds with the simplicity and helplessness she had shown before. It indicated a deep fear of mistreatment from her uncle. I had no way of judging whether his actions justified such intense animosity. Mr. Hadwin's choice of him as the executor was certainly evidence of his integrity. Eliza noticed my distraction and appeared visibly anxious. It was clear that she feared how this seemingly impulsive act had affected my opinion of her. "Please don't be angry with me," she pleaded. "Maybe I did something wrong, but I couldn't help it. I only want one guardian and one protector." The deed was done, and it was irreversible. In my limited knowledge of the Hadwin family's domestic history, I felt inadequate to pass judgment on the circumstances surrounding the decision to leave the care of the house to Caleb. Therefore, it was best not to dwell on it, and instead focus on the immediate situation. We agreed that Caleb would be responsible for securing the house, locking closets and drawers, and taking any money that was found, which amounted to a considerable sum. With these arrangements made, we set out for the previously mentioned house. The weather took a turn for the worse as we embarked on our journey. The air was cold, heavy snow began to fall, and the wind blew fiercely against us. We were forced to brave these elements head-on. Leaving her lifelong home stirred up fresh sorrow in the unhappy girl. rendering her weak and vulnerable. When she was placed on the horse, she could barely maintain her seat. The cold, combined with the snow and wind, left her shivering and disoriented. I had to offer constant reassurance and urging to instill her with the necessary resolve. I am not easily swayed or deterred by the forces of nature when I have set my mind on a particular course. Regrettably, I had overlooked the frailty of my companion's delicate frame and her diminished ability to withstand cold and fatigue compared to myself. It was only after we had made some progress on our journey that I began to truly comprehend the obstacles we were facing. However, I considered it too late to turn back, so I pushed us onward with increased speed. My companion was a skilled rider, but her horse proved stubborn and unruly. Nevertheless, she managed to control the animal's spirit until we had traveled approximately 10 to 12 miles from Malverton. The intensity of the wind and cold became unbearable, and I decided it was necessary to seek refuge at the first house we came across to find warmth and replenishment. We found ourselves amidst a vast expanse of trees, and I knew that a dwelling lay at the end of it. We had to hurry through the woods to reach a place of refuge. I tried to bolster my companion's spirits with this knowledge. While I was talking to her, a sudden gust of wind broke the highest branch of a tree in front of us. It fell a few feet away from her horse's head, causing the animal to panic and veer off the path. In the blink of an eye, it charged into the woods and threw its rider off by colliding with an oak tree. I jumped off my horse and rushed to her aid. The snow was already stained with her blood, which flowed from a wound on her head. She was lying motionless and unconscious. Despite my fear, I searched for the extent of her injuries. Her forehead was badly bruised, but the blood coming out of her nostrils was a sign of relief. I picked her up, looking for a way to help her. The house we were headed to was a mile away, and I couldn't recall any other shelter nearby. The only way to get her to safety was to put her on my horse and ride slowly to the house. However, she was still unconscious, and might not be able to bear her weight when she regained consciousness. First, I had to revive her. I held her close, trying to warm her up. I looked around for any passing carriage that could help us. It was highly unlikely that anyone would willingly brave the fierce and frigid wind for the sake of pleasure or business. Thus, the prospect of encountering a passerby was bleak. Meanwhile, Eliza remained unconscious, and my anxiety grew. I feared the effect that her frozen blood might have on her chances of survival. Leaving the woods with her limp form in my arms, I returned to the road in hopes of spotting a traveler. I scanned the area, straining to hear any sounds over the howling wind, but all I could discern were the sounds of branches cracking and snow falling. Each passing moment only made my own body stiffer and Eliza's situation more dire. What was I to do? To let us both perish was unacceptable. I steeled myself and decided to mount my horse with Eliza still cradled in my arms. It was the only option left. Just then, voices rang out from the woods. They were filled with mirth and glee. Soon, a sleigh carrying several people, both men and women, appeared on a road that intersected with the one I was on. They were moving quickly, but upon seeing us, they slowed their horses and fell silent. This was the stroke of luck I needed, for I had faith in the kindness of these strangers. As they drew closer, I approached them and told them of our situation. They listened with empathy, and one of the young men jumped out of the sleigh to help me place Eliza in the vehicle. A young woman with a sweet demeanor and captivating manners insisted on turning back and hurrying to the house where her father seemed to reside, the very house the group had just left. I followed the sleigh and soon arrived at the spacious and well-kept dwelling. A venerable man and woman, clearly concerned by the sudden return of the young people, came out to inquire about the cause. They warmly welcomed their guest and provided her with all the necessary accommodations. Their own daughter selflessly abandoned her own plans and persuaded her companions to leave without her, choosing instead to stay and care for the sick individual. Fortunately, it became evident after a short time that no serious harm had occurred. The only consequences of the fall were contusions, more troublesome than dangerous, but easily treatable with the remedies of rural and traditional wisdom. With my concerns alleviated, I had the opportunity to contemplate the potential of the current situation. As I observed the structure of the house and the demeanor of its inhabitants, I couldn't help but notice a striking resemblance between this family and the Hadwins. It felt as if some benevolent force had guided us to this place, the most fitting refuge that could be found. Considering the loss Eliza had suffered, the absence of her parents and sister, I conceived that if we could secure their agreement, no abode could be more suitable than this one. There was no time to waste in obtaining their consent. The curiosity of our hosts, Mr. and Mrs. Curling, quickly provided me with the opportunity to reveal the history and true circumstances of my friend. There was no need for reservation or deceit. I faithfully and thoroughly shared every detail. I concluded by expressing my desire for them to welcome my friend as a boarder into their home. The elderly man was agreeable to our plan, while his wife initially had reservations. However, after hearing her husband's and my arguments, she relented. I did not shy away from disclosing the contents of the will, including the fact that Eliza had developed a strong dislike for her uncle, which I could not explain. As our conversation continued, we discovered that Mr. Curling had some knowledge of Philip Hadwin, who had gained a reputation for being stubborn and immoral. It was clear that he would stop at nothing to get his hands on his brother's inheritance. We needed to take steps to prevent him from doing so, and my new acquaintance readily agreed to help us in any way possible. Chapter 22. My emotional state during this time can be easily understood as a mixture of sensations, but overall, they were pleasant. The deaths of Hadwin and his elder daughter naturally brought about deep regrets. However, dwelling on these regrets proved futile, and was outweighed by the realization that the survivor was now in a position of personal security. It was unproductive to expend my care on the deceased, when there was someone who could truly benefit from it, and whose happiness would be a sufficient reward. Nevertheless, this happiness was still incomplete. There were still risks to be faced, and much remained to be done to provide adequate protection against the worst possible outcome, poverty. It became clear that Eliza, being only 15 years old, required a guardian, and legal procedures mandated the appointment of an administrator for her father's affairs. Mr. Curling, who had some knowledge of these matters, explained the necessary steps to be taken and offered to assist Eliza as her trusted friend. There was another matter that demanded our attention and decision-making, as it would greatly impact both my friends and my own happiness. During my stay in Malverton, I found myself drawn to this young woman. I developed feelings for her that were mutual, but I chose to suppress them at the time. However, one may wonder how subsequent events affected my emotions, and whether my involvement in her troubles reignited the passion that had never really left me. The obstacles that had once prevented us from being together had been removed. Her father no longer opposed our union, and her sister was no longer sharing the farm's assets, which meant that there was enough for both of us. She was young and naive, and she needed a legal guardian to protect her, and her happiness was tied to the success of our relationship. As for me, it appeared that everything was falling into place. My own interests dictated that I should pursue a relationship with her, regardless of the consequences for others. The rewards of financial security and independence that would come with owning 100 acres of land were too great to ignore. I had always dreamed of implementing new farming techniques and improving the household's comfort and convenience, and owning this land would allow me to do just that. The absence of these things would not necessarily hinder my happiness or productivity, but their presence would undoubtedly provide me with profound and lasting joy. My mind has always been consumed by thoughts of family, specifically my wife and children. I've always had an active imagination when it came to this topic, with my daydreams being quite ecstatic and fervent. However, since I've met this girl, my thoughts have become more focused and intense. I now have a clear picture of her in my mind, with her sweet and melodious voice ringing in my ears. Her features, gestures, actions, and looks all fill my soul. Any idea related to beauty or sexuality now takes on her form and brings me an indescribable sense of pleasure. Love is only valuable as a prelude to a more intimate and sacred union. Am I in love? Do I long for the irrevocable bounds and boundless privileges of marriage? I ask myself these questions, but I find myself at a loss for an answer. While there are compelling reasons why I should refuse to marry or even pursue a romantic relationship with my friend, I cannot deny the pull I feel toward her. I consider my youth, my limited education, and my narrow perspective. I've only recently left my small village and entered the world, but even in my short time among the bustling crowds of people, I've gained more knowledge than I ever did before. This realization makes me feel like a child with so much more to learn and experience. Is this the right time to make an irrevocable commitment and choose a partner for my future life and intellectual pursuits? I question not only my own readiness, but also Eliza's. Her own knowledge and understanding are even more limited than mine. Can I trust that she will remain calm and open to my guidance? What qualities may time conceal, and how unqualified was I to judge the character of one who had not experienced any hardship until the death of her father? Her ignorance surpassed even my own. Should I mingle with society, join various social classes, witness new scenes and gain knowledge of those whose virtue was the product of experience and growth? Those who possessed modesty and charm, but also the benefits of education, maturity and steadfastness, with whom my character and sentiments would be more akin than with the extreme youth, rustic simplicity, and mental imperfections of Eliza Hadwin. In truth, a revolution occurred within me, and I cannot pinpoint its exact cause. During my recent retreat to Malverton, no signs of this change appeared. But subsequent events, along with meditation, gave birth to new perspectives. During my first visit to the city, I encountered nothing but folly, depravity, and deceit. It was no surprise that the city brought to mind images of disaster and gloom. However, my second visit produced different impressions. Maravegli, Estwick, Medlicott, and you inspired admiration and love. Your dwelling seemed to beautify and consecrate the area, leading me to believe that while cities may be the breeding ground of misery and vice, they are also the soil of all the laudable and strenuous productions of the mind. My thirst for knowledge and curiosity received a new direction. Books and inanimate nature were cold and lifeless teachers. The works of men and mankind were the subjects of rational study, and only our own eyes could provide us with a just comprehension of human achievements. To truly understand the influence of manners, professions, and societal institutions, one must witness them firsthand. The value of competence, property ownership, a stable home life, rural occupations, and the joys of marriage can only be fully appreciated by those who have experienced all walks of life. Traveling to different corners of the globe, mixing with people of all classes and ranks, and experiencing all conditions, is the only way to grasp the true benefits of these things. With this in mind, I decided that the next several years of my life would be devoted to adventure and change. I sought out hardship, danger, and privation as my apprenticeship to fortitude and wisdom to prepare myself for the calm pleasures and unwavering efforts of the rest of my days. In light of these reflections, I resolved to suppress any tenderness that I felt for Miss Hadwin. I needed to correct any misconceptions she may have had and ensure that our relationship remained purely platonic. Ambiguities and delays were to be avoided at all costs. Though she was not immune to passion, I believed that her feelings were still young and could be easily extinguished. After a short time, Miss Hadwin's health was restored, but she remained in a state of gentle melancholy. I saw this as an opportunity to reveal my true thoughts to her. I spoke openly and honestly, explaining my ideas in great detail. I held nothing back, revealing everything in the same order and with similar language to what I have shared with you. I began to recount the impression that Eliza's natural beauty had made on me during our time in Malverton, my reasons for distancing myself from her company, and the current state of my feelings toward her. I expressed my belief about the state of her heart and the thoughts and considerations that had led me to my decisions. I discussed the advantages and inconveniences of marriage and revealed my resolution to seek opportunities in the city, possibly even crossing the ocean. Throughout my narration, Eliza listened without interruption, but her changing expressions, blushing, fluttering, and sighing, revealed her deep and varied emotions in response to my words. I paused, expecting her to provide some observations or comments. Though she seemed aware of my anticipation, she was unable to speak, overwhelmed by her emotions. Eventually her feelings overcame her, and she burst into tears. I was uncertain how to interpret these signs, and waited until her outburst subsided before asking for her opinion. I inquired about her approval of my plans, emphasizing the importance of her approval to me. Her response held a hint of resentment as she said, "You have left me nothing to say. Go, and be happy, no matter what becomes of me. I hope I shall be able to take care of myself." Her words carried a touch of reproach. In response, I assured her that her happiness was too precious to me to be left in jeopardy. I explained that she would be safe and protected in this house, but I would never be too far away to hear about her well-being through letters or to actively work for her welfare. I reminded her of the money she possessed and the need to manage it wisely. While it may take time to receive rent from her farm, Her current funds, if she remained with Mr. Curling, would cover her board and other expenses for 2 years. However, I advised her to be a prudent manager. With a slightly playful yet serious smile, I added that I would expect a regular account of all her words and actions. I firmly told her that I wanted to know how every minute and penny is spent, and that if she made a mistake, I would let her know in no uncertain terms. Despite my words, her sullen expression did not dissipate. She continued to avoid eye contact and stated, "I do not know how I should tell you everything. You care so little about me that I would only be a bother. I am old enough to think and act for myself, and will seek advice from no one but myself." I agreed with her and said that I would be delighted to see her independent and free. I advised her to rely on her own judgment and act according to its guidance, for that was all that was needed for her to become useful and happy. I likewise told her that I was eager to return to the city, but would, with her approval, first go to Malverton to ensure things were in order and check on old Caleb, then afterward visit her uncle to inform him of what had happened to his brother and niece Susan. I pointed out to her that he may have misguided assumptions and harmful intentions, that her uncle may believe he is entitled to manage her estate, that he may think there was a will, or have heard about the one she had destroyed in which he was named as executor. His aggressive and greedy nature may drive him to seize her property unless he is promptly informed of the truth. And when he learns the truth, I said, that he may erupt in anger, which is a situation that I would be better equipped to handle than her. In addition, I told her that I had heard that anger transforms her uncle into a ferocious madman. At the end of this long talk on my plan of action, and the possible adverse reaction of her uncle, should he not be informed about the recent unfortunate events in the life of the Hadwins, I asked Eliza, should I pay him a visit? She shuddered at the image I painted of her uncle's character, but her fear quickly turned into self-blame for how she had rejected my offers of assistance. Once again she dissolved into tears and exclaimed, "I am not worthy of the efforts you make for me. I am a heartless and ungrateful person. Why should I blame you for despising me when I despise myself?" I proceeded to explain, "You are doing yourself a disservice, my friend. I believe I can see your innermost thoughts, and instead of provoking anger or contempt, they elicit compassion and tenderness. You love me, and therefore you may consider my behavior to be obstinate and cruel. I anticipated that you would harbor such thoughts. Only time and reflection will enable you to see my motives in their true light. In the future you will remember my words and find them sufficient to justify my actions. You will acknowledge the appropriateness of my involvement in the world's affairs before I retire to a life of ease." "But then," Eliza countered vehemently, "oh, how wrong you are. I admire and endorse your plans. What angers and distresses me is your belief that I am unworthy of sharing in your burdens and efforts, that you view my company as an obstacle and hindrance, and that all assistance and advice must come from you. You believe that nothing is suitable for me except what you deem to be idle and inglorious. Do I not have the same right to be wise, active, and brave as you? If I am ignorant and weak, is it not for the same reason that has made you so? And will not the same means that promote your advancement also benefit me? You desire to gain knowledge by traveling and conversing with many people and studying many sciences, but you want it for yourself alone. You think of me as poor, weak, and contemptible, fit for nothing except spinning and churning. As long as I exist, am sheltered from the elements, and have enough to eat and drink, you are content. As for strengthening my mind and broadening my knowledge, those things are valuable to you, but you consider them useless to me. I am not deserving of such a gift." This straightforward and fair approach caught me off guard. I was taken aback and disconcerted. In my previous thoughts I had deemed her gender as unsuitable for the pursuits I had planned for myself. I was convinced of this conclusion, but now I began to waver. It was evident that both sexes could gain knowledge and skill, and that fortitude was not limited to one gender. Admittedly, my friend was younger and less experienced, and thus more dependent than I was, but perhaps I had overestimated the challenges I would face. Had I underestimated her strength of character and determination? Marriage would make our property joint, and would not require me to live in the woods, restrict my curiosity, or limit my travels. However, marriage was an unbreakable contract. Was she truly the woman with whom I should unite my fate without the possibility of escape? Would time reveal qualities in her that I had not anticipated, exposing a fundamental difference between us? Would I not eventually find someone who more closely matched my ideal? These were complex and sensitive issues. I was unsure how to express my doubts without appearing arrogant or impolite. Nevertheless, I felt compelled to be honest and risk offending her rather than deceive her. She grasped my meaning from a few words and interrupted me, saying, "Do you think so little of poor Eliza? We are both too young for marriage. May I not see and talk to you without being your wife? May I not share your knowledge, ease your worries, and be privy to your confidence as a sister would? Can I not join you in your travels and studies like a true friend? My belongings can be yours, for our mutual benefit, not because of marital ties, but because of our friendship. You're heading to the city. Allow me to accompany you. Let me reside where you dwell. The abode that can accommodate you will suffice for me. The food that satisfies you will be a luxury for me. Oh, please let it be so, will you? You cannot fathom how studious, how pensive, how curious I will be, how tenderly I will care for you when you're ill. You may fall ill, you know, and no one in the world will be as vigilant and affectionate as I will be. Will you allow me?" Her urgency gave her voice a new and poignant tone. Subconsciously, she drew close to me and, carried away by the allure of the image in her mind, pressed her lips to my cheek and repeated, in a melting voice, "Will you let me?" Those of you who haven't seen Eliza Hadwin can't imagine the impact this plea had on me. She undoubtedly has the sweetest voice, the most expressive features, and the most delicate symmetry of any woman. Her pure and simple nature made her all the more beguiling. To be the object of devotion for such an ardent and virtuous heart was, without a doubt, an extraordinary privilege. She offered herself to me, and wasn't this gift to be received with eagerness and gratitude? No, I wasn't so unfamiliar with humanity as to accept this plan. As either my sister or my wife, society would allow us to live together under one roof, share property, and enjoy each other's company on a daily basis. However, she was neither my sister nor my wife, and to marry her would be an act of utter foolishness. I explained to her the many reasons why this would be a bad idea. "Then," she said, "let me live in the next house, or at least in the same city. Let me see you once a day, once a week, or once a month. Don't shut me out completely. Give me a chance to become less ignorant and foolish than I am now." After a moment of silence, I told her that I loved her too much to deny her request, and that perhaps the city was the best place for her to stay, as it would be most convenient for me. I would be able to keep a better eye on her and provide her with the means to improve herself. But then, I said that she would have to stay put, while I did the tasks of visiting her uncle and proceeding to the city to look for a suitable place for her to live. I promised to inform her the moment I found one. If by that time she still wanted to go to the city, then I would get her, but only after securing Mr. Curling's approval. Our conversation ended there. Even though I agreed to her plan, I knew there were many risks involved. I was afraid of the rumors that might spread and harm my friend's reputation. I was also afraid of my own weakness, which might lead me to make a foolish decision and marry this enchanting woman. But I knew that there was nothing I wouldn't do to protect her from slander. The preservation of a young woman's reputation is of utmost importance, and the absence of a good reputation cannot be compensated for by one's own conscience alone. Considering I was her only protector and friend, I had tenfold concern for this matter. Thus, I held on to a glimmer of hope that time might change her perspective and lead her to consider less perilous plans. In the meantime, I couldn't waste any time in visiting Malverton and Philip Hadwin. Approximately 10 days had passed since we had left Malverton. Those days were marked by successive storms, making travel difficult. However, the weather had now cleared up, and early in the morning following the conversation I had just described, I embarked on my horse. Upon my arrival, I found honest Caleb having his breakfast in almost the same spot where I had first encountered him. In response to my inquiries, he informed me that 2 days after our departure, a group of men, one of whom was Philip Hadwin, had come to the house. They had questioned him about the condition of the farm and why he remained there. They already knew about the passing of William Hadwin, but what about his daughters? Caleb relayed that Susie, the eldest daughter, had also passed away. This news struck them with astonishment. When did she die, and how? Where was she buried? It had happened 2 days prior, and as for the burial, he believed she was buried somewhere but couldn't provide any specific location. Unable to provide more details, Caleb was asked who had buried her. He honestly replied that he didn't know. A peculiar man arrived just as she was nearing her last breath. He entered her room, and after her passing, He took her body away. However, Caleb was uncertain about what happened to the body, although he had a suspicion that it was buried. The man stayed until the morning and then departed with Lizzie, leaving Caleb alone to tend to the house. Since then, he had not seen either of them or encountered another soul. The information that Caleb provided to the visitors was meager at best, and they quickly accused him of lying and threatened legal action. However, Mr. Ellis arrived and shared what he knew about the situation. He recounted my midnight visit to him, my previous role in the family, and my disappearance in September. He also mentioned the advice he had given me to take Eliza to her uncle's, and my promise to follow through with it. The uncle claimed to have not seen his niece, and Caleb added that Eliza had taken the road to town when she left. These details only led to more speculation and suspicion. Ellis then shared some information he had gathered about me during a recent trip to a nearby town. Apparently, I was the son of an honest farmer who had married a milkmaid. My father had caught me making inappropriate advances towards my mother-in-law and had kicked me out of the house. Before leaving, I had stolen hundreds of dollars from his drawer. My neighbors despised me for my arrogance and laziness, and I had a reputation for causing trouble. Ellis was able to piece together that I, Hadwin's servant, and the iniquitous young man described to him were one and the same person. Hadwin had previously spoken highly of me, praising my work ethic, sobriety, and modesty. However, Ellis had always been wary of strangers who came from unknown places and used smooth talk to get by. It was no surprise to hear whispers that Eliza Hadwin had fallen in love with a young man and that he had convinced her to elope with him. As the heiress to a prosperous farm, she was a highly sought-after prize. Upon hearing this news, Philip was consumed with rage. He vowed that if it were true, his niece would be left to fend for herself, and that he would make sure to thwart the young man's plans. Philip was well aware that his brother had left a will, of which he was the executor, and that it would come into play soon enough. After much discussion and a thorough search of the house, Philip and his companions departed, instructing Caleb to look after the property for his use. This was all that Caleb could remember of that day's events. Recently, Curling had commented on Philip's character, revealing him to be a brawler, bully, and tyrant to his children and neighbors. He kept a tavern for drunkards and idlers, and was known for his cunning and malice. He was avaricious, and never missed an opportunity to outsmart his neighbors. If Eliza's property ever fell into his hands, there was no doubt that he would embezzle it. Any power he had over her would be used to her detriment. His children were no better than their father, and marriage had not improved their reputation or morals. Despite knowing all of this, I decided to visit Philip. I was not concerned about the rumors spread by Betty Lawrence, as I knew my father and his neighbors had been deceived by her tricks. As I walked among them, they mistook me for a common thief and a troublemaker, but their mistake did me no harm. The time would come when their tale would be disproven without my intervention. Betty would eventually reveal her true self and undo her own lies, unless some new incident forced me to hasten the end. I arrived at the home of the Hadwins and was welcomed as a guest. I searched the faces on the porch for the landlord, but he was inside with a few others gathered around a table. When I asked to speak with him alone, the others left. Philip Hadwin bore some resemblance to his brother, but his bloated arrogance and imperious manner was in stark contrast to the latter's meek and slender appearance. The man before me was quick to anger, and his life was full of conflict. I wished to end my interview with him as soon as possible. I explained that I had been sent by his deceased brother's youngest daughter, who was preparing to administer the estate since no will had been found. As her uncle, she believed he was entitled to this information. The change in Philip's countenance as I spoke was incredible but difficult to describe. His cheeks grew redder, his eyes glinted, and a look of curiosity mixed with rage washed over his face. He leaned forward and addressed me in a harsh and contemptuous tone, asking if my name was Slaught. I replied confidently, stating that, indeed, my name was Slaught. This seemed to agitate him further, and he unleashed a torrent of profanity-laden speech. He accused me of being the wretched scoundrel who had robbed Billy's house, eloped with his daughter, convinced her to destroy her father's will, and audaciously entered his house. However, he expressed gratitude for my presence, as he had been intending to search for me himself. He vowed to settle all scores with me then and there, threatening me with the gallows and promising a severe beating. He called me impudent, and accused me of orchestrating a plan to undermine the will and steal the cash from the house before fleeing with the girl. He claimed that the old man, Caleb, had witnessed everything, and would testify to the truth of his accusations. These words took me by surprise. I had not intended to hide from this man the content and fate of the will, or even the actions taken or planned by his niece. It seemed that Caleb, despite his initially unassuming demeanor, was more curious and observant than I had realized. Instead of idling by the kitchen fire while Eliza and I conversed upstairs, he had apparently eavesdropped on our conversations through a keyhole or crevice and reported what he had seen to Hadwin. Hadwin vented his fury with a string of curses and threats, clenching his fist and thrusting it toward me in a menacing manner. He repeated the same insults about my impudence and villainy, and even spoke of the gallows and the whipping post. Each word was punctuated with damnable and hellish, and every sentence ended with a curse. I knew better than to engage in a physical altercation with a man of his strength, so I remained seated and kept my composure. I made sure not to show any fear or contempt in my expression, but rather an expectation of harsh words. I knew that any deviation from this balanced demeanor would provoke him to violence. My strategy was to let his rage run its course like a fire that would eventually burn out on its own. I remained calm and collected, diverting his attention from his perceived wrongs to the novelty of my behavior. I knew that my smaller size and weaker strength made it clear that I was not relying on physical force for protection, but rather on my integrity and his potential for restraint. When he finally paused in his ranting, I took the opportunity to reinforce this sentiment. I knew that my safety depended on my ability to manage his anger, and I was determined to do so with patience and composure. I calmly responded to Mr. Hadwin's outburst, stating that his anger and threats did not intimidate me because I knew I could prove my innocence. I reminded him that we were in an inn, and as his guest, I expected better treatment than physical violence. I assured him that it was possible I was not the malicious villain he imagined me to be. I clarified that I had no claims over his niece except that of friendship, and she was currently under the care of an honorable man, Mr. Curling, where she intended to stay as long as necessary. I acknowledged that his brother had indeed left a will, which his daughter had burned in my presence out of fear of the authority it granted him over her property and person. I explained that when she left the house, she took the money that was rightfully hers and essential for her sustenance. I admitted that I accompanied her, but left her in the care of an honest man. I emphasized that I was not accountable for anything beyond that. As for him, I had no intention to harm him, and I did not encourage the burning of the will. I was a stranger to him and did not know his character. I came to inform him of these events because, as Eliza's uncle, he had a right to know. To this, Mr. Hadwin responded sarcastically, saying that I came to tell him that she burned the will and intended to administer what, to which he sarcastically asked if she was going to take over her father's property. He confidently asserted that the property was his, including the land, house, and stock, as everything was protected under a mortgage and a bond, one of which had already been sued and the other entered into a week ago. He declared that everything was under his control, and the girl could either whistle or starve as far as he was concerned. Mr. Hadwin continued his hostile monologue. I shall not trouble myself with concerns about the woman. You may have thought you would gain a prize, but let me assure you, you have met your match in me. Phil Hadwin cannot be easily deceived. I promise you that. My initial intention was to deliver this news to you, and perhaps give you a beating as well. However, you may leave now and hurry on your way. So, she burned the will because my name was in it, and you were sent to inform me of this. Well, how kind of you, and I suppose I should be grateful. Take back news of the mortgage to her, and as for you, leave my house. You may escape punishment for now, but mark my words. A sound beating awaits you the next time you step foot in here. I will make sure to deliver it with interest. Leave, I say. In a soft and low voice, as if intentionally ignoring his commands, I interjected, A mortgage. That will be devastating news for my friend. Sir, you are truly fortunate to own a splendid place like Malverton. It is well watered, well manured, and fully fenced. I doubt there's a larger barn in the entire county. Your livestock, including oxen, horses, and cows, are in excellent condition, and your orchard is simply breathtaking. By my faith, sir, you are indeed a fortunate man. But if I may, what do you have available for dinner? I am famished like a wolf. Could you order me a beef steak and some drink? Ah, I see a bottle of cider over there. Please push it in my direction. As I spoke, I extended my hand toward the bottle positioned in front of him. I relied on projecting an air of fearlessness and composure. I believed that since anger fuels anger, it would naturally diminish when faced with calmness and composure. This notion was based on intuition rather than personal experience, and I must admit that I provided no evidence of my wisdom by risking my safety on this belief. Hadwin's formidable character commanded both fear and obedience from everyone who encountered him. He had never encountered a man like him before, one who was used to commanding submission from those much stronger than myself. His threats and bluster did not affect me, a slight and unimposing figure. The contradiction of my small stature and his inability to intimidate me only served to enrage him further. His hand was raised, poised to strike, but he hesitated. I, however, was always alert, ready to dodge or duck. In the meantime, I took advantage of his distraction and grabbed the bottle, pouring myself a drink. "Here's to you, sir," I said, raising my glass. "May you quickly take possession of Malverton. I have some influence on Eliza, and will convince her to cease any opposition. She has no reason to complain. As long as I am alive, she will not be destitute. Your claim is undoubtedly legal and should be recognized. What the law has given, the law has taken away. Praise be to the dispensers of justice. This cider is excellent. Would you mind opening another bottle and hurrying dinner along? I'm quite famished." It was perhaps fair to pit greed against anger. Reason alone would not have prevailed in this battle, but I spoke honestly and without guile. If his claim was legitimate, fighting it would be foolish and harmful. However, I was not willing to take his word for it. I needed to see the deed for myself, which was currently held in a public office. Until then, I saw no reason to part from him in hostility. His connection to Eliza and her property made it wise to secure his goodwill. It was possible for him to have his claims reduced, even when the law was on his side. It would be foolish to risk his anger and enmity by challenging him. "What?" he roared in a fit of rage. "Am I not the master of my own house? Get out!" His words were harsh, but his gestures and tone were there. "Don't worry, my good friend," I said calmly with a smile. "A man like you need not fear a small fry like me. I won't be able to overthrow you in your own castle with an army of stable hands, bartenders, and chefs at your disposal. You will still be the master here, as long as you use your influence to get me a meal." He reluctantly agreed to a peaceful resolution. He gradually let go of his sullen tone and angry expression, and eventually agreed not only to give me dinner, but to dine with me. He was surprised at his own restraint. He didn't know why he had never been treated this way before. He was not immune to begging and submission, but I had not begged or submitted. I was made of a tough and flexible material. When he thought of my impudence for staying in his house after he had ordered me to leave, he was tempted to resume his anger. When he considered my bravery in downplaying his anger, despite his known impulsiveness and my personal inferiority, he could not help but admire me. But my patience under his rebukes, my unchanging composure, and my willingness to acknowledge the validity of his claims calmed and appeased him. Despite my efforts, all I could obtain from this man was an exemption from physical harm and verbal abuse. I presented him with the truth about my own involvement with the Hadwins, emphasizing the vulnerable state of Eliza. However, he offered me nothing more than permission for her to live with him if she so chose, in exchange for performing household chores in return for food and clothing. If she preferred to live elsewhere, he assured me that he would not interfere with her or her affairs. The house and land were rightfully his according to the law, and he intended to keep them. It was not my place to insult or argue with him. I outlined the actions a compassionate person, concerned for the well-being of an innocent girl closely related by blood, would take. I explained the measures that would be implemented by someone who valued the interests of others over their own, and who genuinely cared for the welfare of this girl, who lacked what is commonly referred to as natural support. He dismissed all of my suggestions as utter nonsense. He expressed astonishment at my foolishness for proposing to gift 100 valuable acres to a girl who could easily be deceived and taken advantage of by any cunning young scoundrel, such as myself. Furthermore, he remarked that my audacity surpassed my foolishness, since, as a friend of this girl, I was essentially advocating for my own interests. I had approached him, a complete stranger with no obligation towards me, and someone who had reason to view me as a con artist, and yet had the audacity to say, "Here's a girl with no fortune, and I am in great need of one. Grant her your estate, and I shall wed her, taking it under my own care," I pleaded. I could have been grateful that he did not respond to such a request with a lash of his horsewhip. However, if he declined to give her his estate, he would offer her his guidance and protection. "That's what I've offered," he continued. She can come live in my abode if she wishes. She can help with some of the household chores. I'll let go of the chambermaid to make room for her. If I recall properly, Lizzie has a pretty face. She won't find a better market for it than as a chambermaid in an inn. If she behaves herself, she can earn a handsome sum at the end of the year. I thought it best to end the conversation, and left after finishing my meal, knowing that I had left behind an impression of being an odd sort of fellow. I rushed to the prothonotry's office, located in the nearby village, and quickly confirmed Hadwin's assertions. There was a mortgage, along with a bond and warrant of attorney, for a sum that would consume everything in Malverton. Equipped with this information, I prepared to return to Mr. Curling with a heavy heart. This occurrence necessitated a change in my perspective on my friend. Her fortune consisted of a few $100s, which, if used wisely, could provide decent accommodations in the countryside. Once depleted, she would have to make a living by tending to the big wheel or the milk pail, unless fate allowed me to place her in a more favorable position. This state of affairs, in some respects, was not much different from the one in which she had spent the earlier years of her life. However, in her father's home, these activities were dignified to some extent by being voluntary and relieved by frequent periods of leisure and recreation. They were now likely to prove bothersome and subservient due to being done for pay and imposed by necessity. Equality, parental worries, and sisterly affection would be absent to ease the burden. However, these issues were merely imagined. This was the place where courage and self-reliance were to be taught. Habit, along with the purity of rural customs, would also recreate those connections that death had severed. The love of a parent and sister would be replaced by the more affectionate and logical bonds of friendship. These labors were not harmful to beauty or health. The only thing to be feared was their inclination to extinguish the spirit of liberal inquiry, to accustom the person to physical rather than intellectual exertions, to replace and generate apathy or aversion to the only tools of rational progress, the pen and the book. However, this evil was still far away from Eliza. Her current home was tranquil and peaceful. Here she could enjoy domestic pleasures and opportunities for mental growth for at least the next year. This time would perhaps be enough to form studious routines. What plans should be made for this goal would be decided by the fate that I myself was reserved for. My path was already marked out, and my imagination now pursued it with extraordinary pleasure. To live in your household, to study your profession, to pursue some lower or occasional form of industry, by which I might buy time for medical studies, for social activities, and for the study of humanity on your busy and crowded stage, was the aim of my desires. This destiny would not hinder timely communication and occasional visits to Eliza. Her pen could be put to use, and her mind could be awakened by books, and every hour could be made to contribute to her knowledge and expand the limits of her capacity. I left with a heavy heart, but as I pondered on my future and the situation of my friend, my mood began to lift. When I arrived at Mr. Curling's place that evening, I immediately shared the outcome of my mission with Eliza. She was disappointed that her hopes of living in the city were dashed, but my promise to keep in touch and visit occasionally comforted her. The next day, I began my journey here on foot. It wasn't a long way, and despite the cold weather, it was refreshing and peaceful. My spirits were high, and I felt nothing but optimism for what lay ahead. I knew that my happiness wasn't dependent on external factors, but rather on my own honest and unwavering intentions. Every experience was an opportunity for growth and knowledge, and I reveled in the beauty and grandeur of my own thoughts. This euphoria was short-lived, however. Memories of the past, particularly those involving your family, began to flood my mind. I thought of Welbeck and the woman he had betrayed, as well as Mrs. Villiers and Wallace. My plans to help Clemenza and determine her fate resurfaced, and I questioned whether I should abandon them altogether in light of the uncertainty surrounding the Hadwins. It was a troubling conclusion to reach. It's no wonder that I struggled with these thoughts, attempting to fend off the idea that money was the sole means of providing assistance. Could it be possible that caution, resilience, and knowledge were the true safeguards against evil? Didn't I possess the means to dispel Eliza's dangerous ignorance of Welbeck and those she lived with? Wasn't I justified, based on our previous albeit limited interaction, in seeking her presence? Why should I fret about smoothing the path, offering apologies, or resorting to ambiguous hints? These feeble and convoluted tactics were unworthy of a genuine purpose and a resolute spirit. To believe that she was inaccessible to my visit was absurd. To wait for the permission of those who might have an interest in keeping visitors at bay was an act of cowardice. It was an infringement upon her freedom that both equity and the law condemned. By what right could she be restrained from engaging with others? There might be doors and hallways between her and me, but with an intention like mine, no one had the authority to close those doors or impede my path. Away with these timid hesitations and baseless scruples. I must seize this moment and hasten to her dwelling. Mrs. Villars is the gatekeeper of the house, and she will likely confront me and inquire about the purpose of my visit. What shall I say to her? The truth. It would be wicked to falter, equivocate, or deceive this woman. Perhaps her character has been misconstrued and unfairly maligned. Is there a greater service I could offer her than to inform her of the accusations that have tarnished her reputation and provide her with the opportunity to defend herself? Or perhaps she truly is self-centered and immoral, involved in the corruption of young individuals and engaged in lascivious activities. Doesn't she deserve to know the extent of her wrongdoing and the shame of her actions? Should she not receive both sympathy from the kind and admonishment from the wise? To shy away from this task would be a sign of cowardice and weakness. At least for now, I will extend my courage. Unfortunately, Clemenza does not understand my language. My thoughts can only be conveyed through words, and she will not understand my words. But is that a hasty assumption? The version of Zeno's dramas that I found in her bathroom was likely hers, indicating she has some knowledge of our language. It has been nearly 6 months since then, during which she has been surrounded by English speakers and likely picked up the language. This conclusion may be uncertain, but an experiment will confirm it. I had been walking slowly, thinking I had enough time to reach your doorstep between sunrise and moonlight, even if my journey was 3 times longer. You were the image that kept me moving forward, beckoning me. In just a few seconds, my thoughts about Clemenza and Villars had undergone a complete transformation, and I muttered to myself about them. My muscles were shaking with eagerness, and I rushed forward with great force. All I could see was a path lined with catalpas, their leaves gone and icicles hanging from them, leading to a roof with 4 chimneys. My imagination was already envisioning faces and conversations. Finally, I arrived at my destination and hurried through the avenue. I noticed that some of the windows were open, indicating that someone was inside. I knocked loudly and quickly, hoping for entry. Someone inside cautiously approached the door, opening it just enough to show the face. The girl standing before me appeared timid and pale, as if she had not seen the light of day in some time. I assumed she was a servant, taken from a small cottage and forced into a life of manual labor. She waited silently for me to deliver my message. I asked if Mrs. Villars was home, to which she replied that she had gone to town. I inquired if any of her daughters were present, and she hesitated before asking if I wanted to see Miss Hetty or Miss Sally. I requested to see Miss Hetty, and pushed open the door to the parlor. The girl reluctantly moved aside, and I stepped into the room, instructing her to go fetch Miss Hetty. I would wait for her in the parlor. The room was spacious and adorned with expensive furnishings, but it was clear that no effort had been made to maintain it. The carpet was wrinkled and unswept, the clock on the table was covered in dust and stuck at 4 o'clock, and the fireplace was littered with ashes. The harpsichord was uncovered, and books were scattered haphazardly about the room. It was evident that the household lacked discipline and order. As I waited for Miss Hetty, I took in the room's disorder and listened for her approaching footsteps. However, several minutes passed, and no one came. I tried to find reasons to delay, summoning patience as I waited. I glanced at the book on the table, touched the musical instrument, observed the vases on the mantelpiece, studied the figures on the tapestries, and admired the print of Apollo and the Sibyl, inspired by Salvator Rosa, hanging above the fireplace. I caught sight of my own reflection in the mirror, and wondered how my rural appearance would be received by that haughty and pleasure-seeking woman whom I was about to encounter. Soon, the latch of the door moved gently, and it opened to reveal the simple-minded girl I had encountered before. She spoke softly and hesitantly, making it difficult to discern her words. She claimed that Miss Hetty was not at home and had gone to the town with her mistress. This was a story that seemed incredulous. How should I proceed? She persisted in maintaining the truth of her statement. "Well then," I finally replied, "please inform Miss Sally that I wish to speak with her. She will serve my purpose just as well." However, Miss Sally was also not at home. She had gone to the town as well, and they would not be back until night, or so the girl supposed. None of them were at home, except for her and Nanny in the kitchen. "Go and tell Nanny to come here. I will leave my message with her," I instructed. The girl withdrew, but Nanny either did not receive the summons or chose not to obey it. All was silent and empty. My situation was peculiar and critical. It was foolish to prolong it, yet leaving the house without accomplishing my purpose would imply weakness and folly. Determining Clemenza's presence in this house and securing an audience with her was still within my power. Hadn't I boasted of my fearlessness in defying denials and commands that sought to hinder my path to this woman? But here, there were no obstacles or prohibitions. If the girl was telling the truth, and the matron and her daughters were indeed absent, then my plan would proceed without opposition. All I had to do was climb the stairs and search each room until I found what I was looking for. It was a risky plan, but it had its plausibility. Before proceeding, I decided to try and get more information from the girl and convince her to guide me to whoever else was in the house. I rang the bell, but no one came. I walked into the entryway and looked out the back window.